There are loves that begin with the thunder of passion and end in the silence of contempt. There are rescues that cost everything, yet purchase only bitterness. And there are hearts that beat as one beneath the moon, only to grow cold as stone beneath the sun of destiny. This is the story of a princess who defied her father, a shepherd who conquered giants, and a love that could not survive the weight of a crown. Before we journey into this ancient tale of devotion and despair, consider walking with us through more of these profound biblical truths by subscribing to this channel, for the stories of faith are the stories of our own souls written large across the canvas of eternity. In the Golden Age, when Israel first cried out for a king, when the nation abandoned the invisible throne of the Almighty for the visible seat of mortal power, there ruled a man named Saul. Tall as a cedar of Lebanon, broad as an oak of Bashan, he stood head and shoulders above every man in Israel, as the first book of Samuel chapter 9 verse 2 tells us. The prophet Samuel had anointed him with sacred oil, and for a season, the Spirit of God rested upon him like a mantle of fire. But pride, that ancient serpent that brought down angels before it felled humans, coiled around his heart. Disobedience followed, and with it came the terrible pronouncement from the prophet's lips that his kingdom would not endure, that God had sought out a man after his own heart, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 14. The palace in Gibeah stood against the Judean hills, its stone walls keeping watch over a kingdom that trembled beneath the shadow of the Philistines. Within those walls lived Saul's children, among them his daughter Michal, whose name meant rivulet or brook, a flowing of water in a land of stone and sand. She moved through the corridors of power with the grace of one born to royalty, yet her heart harbored something her father had lost, something that would prove both her salvation and her curse. The tapestries hung heavy in the palace halls, dyed with purple from Phoenician shores, and the servants whispered of the king's increasingly dark moods, of how the spirit that once blessed him now tormented him, how music alone could soothe the storms that raged within his royal skull. It was into this troubled court that a young man came, ruddy and handsome, with beautiful eyes, as 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 12 describes him. David, son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, arrived not as a conqueror but as a servant, summoned to play the lyre for a king whose mind had become a battlefield between divine abandonment and demonic oppression. His fingers drew from the strings melodies that seemed to descend from heaven itself, notes that could calm the tempest in Saul's breast and bring tears to the eyes of those who listened. Michal heard him before she saw him. She heard the music floating through the palace like incense, carrying with it a peace that her father's house had not known in many months. When finally her eyes found him, when she watched him standing before her father with his instrument cradled against his chest, his gaze steady and clear, something stirred within her that she had never known. Love, they say, is a kind of madness, and indeed it drove her to abandon reason, to forget station and protocol, to feel her heart beating to the rhythm of his songs. The scriptures record it simply and profoundly in 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 20. Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. But in those 5 words lies an ocean of passion, an entire world of yearning, a devotion that would soon be tested by fire and blood. David's fame spread like wildfire across Israel. The giant Goliath of Gath fell before him in the valley of Elah, his massive frame crashing to earth as David's stone found its mark, as told in 1 Samuel chapter 17. The young shepherd became a warrior, and the warrior became a hero. The women danced in the streets, their tambourines ringing out a song that would poison everything it touched. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 7. Those words, innocent on the lips of celebration, became daggers in the heart of a king who could not bear to be surpassed. Jealousy, more venomous than any serpent in the wilderness, sank its fangs deep into Saul's soul. The king's eyes followed David with a new intensity, calculating, measuring, searching for weakness. And in his cunning, Saul devised a plan that would destroy this threat without staining his own hands with blood. He would offer David his daughter Merab as wife, demanding only that the young warrior continue to fight the Lord's battles, secretly hoping that the Philistines would accomplish what he himself could not, as 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 17 reveals. But Merab was given to another, and Saul's scheme seemed to unravel. It was then that servants came to the king with news that ignited a terrible idea in his mind. They told him that Michal loved David. Here was an opportunity wrapped in the garments of paternal generosity. Saul would offer his daughter, not as a gift of honor but as a snare, a trap baited with love itself. He sent messengers to David, speaking honey-coated words about becoming the king's son-in-law. But David, ever conscious of his humble origins, protested his unworthiness. He was poor, of no reputation, not deserving to marry into the royal house. Saul's response was calculated cruelty disguised as mercy. He required no bride price of silver or gold. Instead, he demanded 100 foreskins of the Philistines, certain that David would fall in the attempt, as 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 25 records. The king desired nothing more than to see David delivered into the hands of his enemies. But Saul had underestimated the courage burning in David's breast, the favor of God that rested upon him like armor, and perhaps most dangerously, the depth of David's own feelings for Michal. The young warrior gathered his men and went forth into Philistine territory like a lion among sheep. The mission was deadly, the odds overwhelming, yet David returned not with 100 proofs of victory, but with 200, doubling the bride price as if to declare that no cost was too high for love, as 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 27 tells us. He laid them before Saul, and the king could do nothing but fulfill his promise, though it galled him like poison. Michal became David's wife. Imagine, if you will, the moment when she became his. The ceremony in the palace, the joining of hands, the ancient words spoken over them. Michal, daughter of kings, princess of Israel, bound herself to a man her father had already determined to destroy. Did she know? Did she sense the darkness gathering around her bridegroom like storm clouds? If she did, her love proved stronger than her fear. She stood beside him, this shepherd warrior who had captured her heart with music and valor, and she made herself his shield. The honeyed days of their union were brief. Saul's madness grew like a cancer, spreading through every thought, corrupting every intention. Twice he hurled his spear at David while the young man played music to soothe him, as 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 11 records. The weapon embedded itself in the wall, missing David's head by mere inches. The message was clear. There would be no peace, no safety, no future in Saul's house for the one who had won the people's love. David became a hunted man in his own home, a son-in-law marked for death by the very father who had given him his daughter. The night came when everything changed. Darkness had fallen over Gibeah like a shroud, and in the palace, murder was being planned. Saul sent his men, armed and merciless, to watch David's house through the night, with orders to kill him when morning came, as 1 Samuel chapter 19 verse 11 reveals. But Michal discovered the plot. Perhaps a servant loyal to her whispered the warning, or perhaps she simply knew her father's heart too well. She came to David in the darkness, her voice urgent, her eyes wide with fear. She told him that if he did not flee that very night, by morning he would be dead. Here was the moment that would define her. Here was the choice that would echo through all her remaining days. Michal was the daughter of a king, raised in luxury and power, taught that obedience to her father was sacred duty. Yet she chose to betray that father to save her husband. She did more than warn David. She became his accomplice in escape. With her own hands, she let him down through a window, lowering him into the night like a parcel of precious cargo, as 1 Samuel chapter 19 verse 12 records. She watched him disappear into the darkness, not knowing if she would ever see him again, knowing only that his life mattered more to her than her own safety. But Michal's courage did not end with David's escape. When Saul's men came pounding on the door at dawn, demanding David's presence, she transformed from rescuer to deceiver with remarkable skill. She took a household idol, that teraphim which many kept despite the commandments against graven images, and she laid it in the bed. She covered it with garments and placed goat's hair at its head to mimic David's dark locks, as 1 Samuel chapter 19 verse 13 describes. Then she told the soldiers that David was ill, too sick to rise. It was a ruse born of desperation and brilliance, buying precious hours for David to put distance between himself and death. When Saul learned of the deception, his rage was terrible. He sent the men back with orders to bring David to him, bed and all, so that he might kill him personally, as 1 Samuel chapter 19 verse 15 reveals. But when they tore away the coverings, they found only the idol and the goat's hair, a mockery of the king's murderous intent. Saul turned his fury upon his daughter. He confronted her, demanding to know why she had deceived him, why she had sent away his enemy. And Michal, this woman who had risked everything for love, lied to her father's face. She claimed that David had threatened her, that he had said he would kill her if she did not help him escape, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 19 verse 17. It was a betrayal of her betrayal, a self-preservation wrapped in false accusation, and perhaps the first crack in the foundation of her love for David. The years that followed were years of exile and hardship for David. He fled to the prophet Samuel, then to the priests at Nob, then to the Philistine city of Gath, always moving, always hunted, gathering around him a band of outcasts and warriors who would become his mighty men. He hid in caves, in the wilderness of Judea, in strongholds carved into cliffs where eagles nested. He lived on the run, sleeping on stone, eating what he could hunt or gather, his life constantly threatened by Saul's relentless pursuit. And through all of this, Michal remained in her father's house, a princess without her prince, a wife separated from her husband. Saul, in an act of cold political calculation, gave Michal to another man. He took his own daughter, David's lawful wife, and married her to Palti, son of Laish, who was from Galilim, as 1 Samuel chapter 25 verse 44 records. It was an act of profound cruelty, a legal fiction designed to sever David's connection to the royal house and to humiliate him even in his absence. For Michal, it was a forced remarriage, a violation that transformed her from a woman who had chosen love into a pawn moved across the board of her father's hatred. What she felt in those years, the scriptures do not say. Did she love Palti? Did she merely endure? Did she think of David in his caves? Or did bitterness begin to grow in her heart like thorns in a neglected garden? The wheel of fortune turned with the inexorable patience of divine providence. In the mountains of Gilboa, where the land rises steep and treacherous, the final battle came. The Philistines fell upon Saul's army like wolves upon sheep, as 1 Samuel chapter 31 describes. His sons died fighting, Jonathan the beloved, Abinadab and Malchishua, cut down in their prime. Saul himself, wounded by archers, took his own life rather than face capture, falling upon his sword in an act of desperate pride. The first king of Israel perished not in glory but in defeat, his body desecrated by the enemies he had spent his life fighting. The kingdom that had begun with such promise ended in blood and failure. David's grief at the news was genuine and profound. He tore his garments and wept, composing a lamentation that would be remembered for generations, as 2 Samuel chapter 1 records. He mourned for Saul despite everything the king had done to him, and he mourned for Jonathan, his soul's companion, declaring that Jonathan's love had been more wonderful to him than the love of women, as 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 26 tells us. Those words, beautiful and tragic, carried within them an unintended wound for Michal, if ever she heard them. She had risked everything for David, had saved his life, had betrayed her father for him. Yet here he was declaring that his friend's love surpassed all others. David was anointed king, first over Judah in Hebron, and the years of wandering transformed into years of conquest and consolidation. He was no longer the fugitive hiding in caves but the monarch building a kingdom. He took more wives, as was the custom of kings, adding to his household women who brought political alliances and bore him sons. Yet even as he gathered wives around him, he did not forget Michal. When the time came to unite all Israel under his rule, David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son who claimed the northern kingdom. His demand was clear and calculated. Return to me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for 100 foreskins of the Philistines, as 2 Samuel chapter 3 verse 14 records. It was a political move as much as a personal one. By reclaiming Saul's daughter, David reinforced his legitimate connection to the previous dynasty, strengthening his claim to rule all Israel. But it was also deeply personal, a reclamation of what had been stolen from him, a restoration of the wife who had once loved him enough to save his life. Ishbosheth complied, and Michal was taken from Palti, torn away from the man she had lived with for years. The scriptures paint a heartbreaking picture of Palti following behind her, weeping as he walked, until he was finally ordered to turn back and go home, as 2 Samuel chapter 3 verse 16 reveals. Here was another man whose heart broke in the wake of royal politics, another casualty in the story of David and Michal's reunion. What did Michal feel as she was brought back to David? The scriptures do not tell us, but we can imagine. She had been a young woman in love when last they were together, willing to defy her father and risk everything. Now she was older, scarred by years of being used as a political tool, having lived with another man, returning to a husband who had become a king and accumulated multiple wives. The girl who had once watched him play the lyre and felt her heart sore was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned that love could be weaponized, that devotion could be discarded, that even the greatest passion could be crushed beneath the weight of ambition and power. David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, that sacred chest containing the tablets of the law, the symbol of God's presence among his people. It was a moment of tremendous spiritual and political significance, the establishment of Jerusalem as the holy city, the center of worship for all Israel. David did not approach this moment with the dignity and reserve of a king. Instead, he stripped off his royal robes and danced before the ark wearing only a linen ephod, that simple priestly garment. He leaped and whirled with all his might before the Lord, as 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 14 records, leading the celebration with uninhibited joy, his movements wild and free, abandoning all concern for royal protocol in his worship. Michal watched from a window in the palace. She stood behind the lattice as the procession passed below, as the people shouted and the trumpets blared, as the ark was carried through the streets. And there was David, the king of Israel, dancing with such abandon that he appeared to her eyes not as a monarch but as a madman, not as the dignified ruler of a nation but as a common entertainer making a spectacle of himself. In that moment, as 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 16 tells us, she despised him in her heart. That word despised is profound and terrible. It is not mere disappointment or disapproval. It is contempt, a deep-seated scorn that had been growing in her soul through all the years of separation and pain. When David returned to bless his household, flushed with the joy of worship, Michal met him not with celebration but with cutting sarcasm. She mocked him for uncovering himself before the servant girls, for displaying himself like some vulgar fool rather than conducting himself with the honor befitting a king. Her words dripped with bitterness and disdain, as recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 20. Here was the woman who had once loved him expressing not affection but contempt, not admiration but scorn. The princess who had saved the shepherd had become the queen who despised the king. David's response was fierce and unyielding. He declared that he had danced before the Lord, who had chosen him over her father and over all her father's house to appoint him ruler over Israel. He proclaimed that he would celebrate before the Lord and would become even more undignified than this, willing to be humiliated in his own eyes if it meant honoring God. He added, with cutting precision, that those slave girls she mentioned would honor him, even if she would not, as 2 Samuel chapter 6 verses 21 through 22 record. It was a complete rejection of her criticism, a reassertion of his priorities, and perhaps most painfully, a declaration that he no longer needed or valued her approval. The final verse about Michal is devastating in its brevity. The scriptures tell us in 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 23 that Michal, daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Whether this was divine judgment for her contempt, or David's personal rejection manifested in abandoning her bed, or simply the natural consequence of a marriage that had died in all but name, we cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that the woman who had risked everything for love ended her days barren, childless in a culture that measured a woman's worth by her offspring, isolated from the husband she had once saved, a living reminder that even the greatest passion can wither into contempt when tested by time and circumstance. There is a terrible poetry in Michal's story, a tragic arc that moves from love to rescue to abandonment to bitterness to contempt. She began as a woman who defied her father to save the man she loved, who lowered him from a window to preserve his life, who lied to protect him from murder. She ended as a woman who despised that same man for his unrestrained worship, who saw in his dancing not devotion but disgrace, who could not or would not celebrate his triumphs because her own heart had turned to stone. What transformed her? Was it the years of forced separation, being given to another man like property while David gathered wives and concubed kingdoms? Was it the realization that she had been reclaimed not primarily out of love but out of political necessity, one more chess piece moved to secure his throne? Was it watching him dance with such joy, such freedom, such utter abandonment before God, while she had spent years imprisoned by circumstances beyond her control, her own emotions locked away behind palace walls? Or was it simply the corrosive power of bitterness itself, that acid that eats away at the soul until nothing remains but contempt? The scriptures do not psychoanalyze Michal. They present her actions and her fate without extensive commentary, leaving us to ponder the depths of her tragedy. But in her story, we see timeless truths about love and sacrifice, about how even the most heroic devotion can sour when it is taken for granted or instrumentalized for other purposes. We see how political power corrupts personal relationships, how the girl who loved a shepherd could not love the king he became, perhaps because the king was too different from the shepherd, or perhaps because she was too different from the girl. There is also something deeply human in Michal's contempt. She had endured so much, sacrificed so much, and what had it gained her? David lived, yes, but he lived for his kingdom, for his God, for his many wives and children. Where was her reward for her courage? Where was the recognition of her sacrifice? She watched from a window, always from a window, as life and joy and celebration happened below her, as David danced with abandon for the same God who seemed to have forgotten her. Her contempt was perhaps the only power she had left, the only way she could assert her existence, her pain, her profound disappointment with how her story had unfolded. Yet we must also see David's perspective with clarity. He had never asked Michal to save him, though he certainly benefited from her intervention. He had not chosen to be separated from her. Saul had made that choice when he gave her to another man. And when he danced before the ark, he was not thinking of Michal's approval or disapproval. He was worshiping the God who had lifted him from the sheep pastures to the throne, who had delivered him from Goliath and from Saul and from all his enemies. His joy was pure and his motives were genuine, even if his actions wounded his wife. Sometimes righteousness and relationship come into conflict, and David chose the former, perhaps necessarily, perhaps at great cost. The question that haunts Michal's story is this: could it have been different? Could the love that began with such passion and courage have survived the pressures of power and politics? Could the princess and the shepherd king have found their way back to each other, or was their separation too long, their experiences too different, the wounds too deep? There is no answer, only the melancholy certainty that what began in love ended in contempt, that the woman who saved David's life could not save their marriage, that rescue and devotion are not always enough to sustain a relationship through the storms of time. Michal's tragedy is compounded by her isolation. She is not remembered as one of the great women of faith like Sarah or Ruth or Esther. She is not celebrated for her courage in saving David, though that act of defiance required tremendous bravery. Instead, she is remembered primarily for her contempt, for that moment when she despised David in her heart as he danced before the Lord. Her barrenness becomes her defining characteristic in the biblical narrative, a final statement about a life that began with such promise but ended in emptiness. Yet perhaps we should remember Michal more kindly than history has. Perhaps we should honor her courage in that dark night when she lowered David through the window, risking her father's wrath to save the man she loved. Perhaps we should acknowledge the impossible position she was placed in, torn between father and husband, used by both as a tool for their purposes, never truly free to choose her own path. Perhaps we should see in her story not just a warning about bitterness but also an indictment of a world where women were traded like commodities, where love could be commanded and uncommanded by royal decree, where a heart brave enough to defy a king for love could be broken so completely by the very man she saved. The years passed, and David's kingdom grew strong. He conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital. He defeated the Philistines and the Moabites and the Arameans. He sinned with Bathsheba and suffered the consequences. He faced rebellion from his own son Absalom. Through all of this, Michal remained in the palace, barren and bitter, a ghost of the girl who had once loved a shepherd boy with such fierce devotion that she betrayed her own father. The scriptures mention her no more after recording her barrenness, as if she had simply faded from the narrative. Her story complete, her purpose in the grand drama of David's life fulfilled and finished. When David was old and dying, surrounded by his sons and his servants, debating who would succeed him on the throne, was Michal there? Did she watch from another window as Solomon was proclaimed king? Did she remember the young man who had played the lyre for her father, whose music had once stirred her heart? Did she ever regret her contempt, or did she carry it to her grave as the only treasure she had left, the final assertion of her dignity in a life that had stripped her of so much else? The scriptures are silent, and we are left with questions that have no answers, with a story that ends not with resolution but with emptiness. There is a lesson here about the fragility of love, about how even the strongest devotion can be destroyed by time and circumstances. There is a lesson about sacrifice, about how giving everything for someone does not guarantee that they will value your gift or that your relationship will survive the giving. There is a lesson about bitterness, about how it can poison everything it touches, transforming the one who harbors it from rescuer to critic, from lover to despiser. And there is a lesson about priorities, about how sometimes the call to worship God with abandon means accepting that others will not understand, will not approve, may even despise us for it. Michal's story is ultimately a tragedy, one of the great tragedies of Scripture, precisely because it began with such love and ended with such contempt. She loved David when he was nothing, when he was merely a shepherd boy with a lyre and a sling. She saved his life at tremendous personal risk. And yet when he became the king, when he danced before God with joy, she could not celebrate with him. The distance between them had grown too great, the wounds too deep, the transformations too complete. They were no longer the young people who had found love in a troubled palace. They were a barren queen and a dancing king, existing in the same space but living in different worlds entirely. As we reflect on this ancient story of passion and rescue, of love given and love lost, of courage that saved a life but could not save a marriage, let us consider our own hearts. Do we harbor contempt for those who have disappointed us? Do we cling to bitterness over sacrifices that were not appreciated as we believed they should be? Do we judge others for their expressions of faith and devotion simply because they do not match our expectations of dignity and decorum? Michal's story warns us that contempt is corrosive, that bitterness is barren, that love requires not only courage but also grace, forgiveness, and the ability to celebrate others even when our own circumstances are painful. The window from which Michal watched David dance stands as a symbol across the centuries. She was always watching from windows, lowering him through one to save his life, watching from another as he danced away from her forever. Windows separate us from what we observe. They allow us to see without participating, to judge without engaging, to remain safe and protected while life happens on the other side of the glass. Michal's tragedy was perhaps not just that she despised David but that she had become a watcher rather than a participant, an observer rather than a dancer, someone who viewed life from behind barriers rather than throwing herself into it with abandon. If this story of love and loss, of rescue and rejection, of passion transformed into contempt has stirred something within your soul, share it with those who need to hear these ancient truths. Subscribe to journey deeper into the profound narratives that shape our faith and reveal our humanity. For in these stories of kings and shepherds, of princesses and prophets, we find mirrors that reflect our own hearts, our own struggles, our own desperate need for grace. Michal saved David's life but could not save their love, and in that tragedy, we are reminded that some things require more than courage, more than devotion, more than sacrifice. Some things require the very grace of God Himself, the only force powerful enough to heal the wounds that time and circumstance inflict, the only love that never fails, never despises, never ends in barrenness but always, always bears fruit that lasts forever.